In V Rising, soul shards are everything. They're the pinnacle accomplishment, the most overpowered items in the game, the goal and win condition for most tournament servers. They are proof of beating the game. Now, I like pushing games to their limits, and so it's only natural that I try to attain the soul shards as fast as possible. In the last episode of Breaking the Game, I figured out a way of taking Styx the Sunderer down at level 58, giving me access to fight all 3 of the final Soul Shard bosses. In this episode, I'm going to take that same set of level 58 gear and give the Winged Horror a little visit. The first time I fought the Winged Horror, I went in with zero preparation. I'd never seen the boss, didn't know any of its abilities, and had no idea what to expect. I beat it without any difficulty, because the Winged Horror, if done in standard progression, is probably one of the easiest bosses in the game. However, doing it 20 levels under is a completely different story. You see, there are 2 things about this boss that make it unusually challenging to do when extremely under-leveled. First, the Winged Horror has a time limit. Once you're up on its peak, there is effectively zero shade, and so fighting him during the day is not an option, meaning you have 1 night's duration or 15 in-game hours to kill it, and when you're 20 levels under, your attacks tickle it. The second issue is that the Winged Horror's attacks inflict the Chaos Burn debuff. Chaos Burn applies a damage over time to you, and in this case, that dot lasts for 5 minutes. And unfortunately, there's no way to just not take this debuff, as not only does basically every attack he has apply it, but also he leaves a bunch of pools on the ground that apply it as well. Normally, this isn't too much of an issue, as you can take something like Power Surge to cleanse it off, or use something like Sanguine Coil to go through the damage over time, but when you're under-leveled, you don't have access to a cleanse, and the damage shreds you, making healing through it impossible. Now, luckily you can't die to the dot damage in this game, but it does get you down to 1 HP, or in this game 0 HP for some reason, very fast. Now, each of these problems individually wouldn't be too bad to deal with. For the time limit, you can just go full offense on every ability and really maximize your DPS, and for the dot, you can just play safe and focus on avoiding getting hit at all with some strong defensives. Now, you can probably see where I'm going with this, but unfortunately, you can't have both. If you're going to play a defensive fight, you can't maximize your DPS, and if you're going to maximize your DPS with offensive abilities, your defense will suffer heavily. So in order to take this fight under-leveled, you have to sacrifice either your offense or your defense, and in our case, there's only one option. Since we can't control the sun, we have to sacrifice all of our defense and just go for pure damage to kill the Winged Horror before the night ends. That means doing basically a no-hit fight with the Winged Horror without any defensive abilities aside from our space. We have to dodge almost everything with just the movement of our character. This makes the fight quite challenging, but also really fun. This is why I love pushing games to the limits. It takes what is normally a pretty basic, easy fight and turns it into a very skillful challenge, because the Winged Horror has some moves that you would really like to avoid. The defining one is his charge. He uses this move from the start of the fight onwards, and it is technically easily dodged with movement if you walk perpendicular to him once he starts the charge, but if you're casting anything as he starts it, you won't be fast enough. Meaning it would be really nice to be able to space this ability so we can keep up the DPS without having to worry about it. But we can't, because of his melee attack. If you're in melee range, the Winged Horror will sometimes use this melee swipe that sends out icicles, and this move slaps. It will one-shot you even from full HP, and it has multiple damage instances that make it hard to deal with. But more importantly, you can't dodge it with specific movement, meaning you're forced to either use your space or take some defensive ability for it. Now, long story short, you have to save your space for this melee attack. You can't afford to play the fight in a way where he won't use it, and you also can't afford to take a defensive ability for it specifically. So that means we have to deal with the charge without using our space. Now remember, we can dodge it easily with specific movement, but not if we are already casting. However, we can't wait and sit around for him to charge before we start casting abilities, or we lose way too much DPS. So we have to dodge it the hard way, which is to position yourself in between the Winged Horror and the Chaos Balls that he summons next to him. Now, this is pretty hard to do consistently, especially with all the camera movement needed for the fight, so thankfully we don't have to rely on this for too long, because when he gets to around 75% HP, phase 2 of the fight starts, which is actually a lot easier than phase 1. In phase 1, he really only has 2 abilities that he will use on you, not including the melee attack, so when they are both on cooldown, he'll just walk at you and then melee. But in phase 2, he adds more abilities, meaning that he will always have something off cooldown to use on you, making him very rarely get in melee range, and thus rarely use his melee icicle attack anymore. For the final fight, unfortunately we have to craft more weapons. Sticks can be done with only slashers, but for the Winged Horror, you absolutely need a crossbow and one weapon with a good damage ranged E ability, like axes or scythe. It's unfortunate because it takes time to craft them that we didn't really want to spend, but it's 100% needed. Now, phase 1 of the fight, as I went over earlier, is basically just ranged abilities and trying to maximize DPS while sidestepping the charge and spacing the melee. Now for our abilities, obviously Chaos Volley will take one spot, but for the other one, the only ability that we have unlocked is Shadow Bolt. Although, more practically, if we were to do an actual run, there's a good chance we would kill Nicholas the Fallen if we got any useful scroll recipes, which would also unlock Pestilence for slightly more damage, so I would use that if possible. Similarly for our space, the only 2 we have unlocked on this point are the Veils of Chaos and Blood, so although this isn't the best damage space, Veil of Chaos is the choice. And again, just like the space, there are really no good options for our ultimate, so spiders it is. Once the Winged Horror gets to around 75% HP and flies up the air, you have 2 options for how to proceed the rest of the fight. There's a physical damage route and a spell damage route. So before the fight, you want to look for either High Warrior or High Scholar blood and take whichever route according to the blood that you found. For the spell power, you don't change much up. The only thing is Shadow Bolt is a little bit easier than Pestilence to land, as typically you take the rest of the fight at a little bit longer range than the first 25% of the fight, but Pestilence will still offer a tiny bit more DPS, so I would suggest going that if your blood percentage is a little bit lower than ideal. For the physical damage route, I know this sounds weird, but we're actually going to swap out our second ranged ability for Chaos Shield. The reason for this is that it allows us to play much more aggressively with the crossbow. Basically, whenever your abilities are on cooldown, you can just sit there and hold down left mouse button and shoot with the crossbow, and then respond to any of the moves that the Winged Horror uses with either the shield or your space. Basically, it just increases the amount of time you're available to sit there doing damage, instead of dodging his moves with movement of your own. And just as a note, you can use this for the first phase as well, but it's not quite as fast, so it's just only using it for the second. Unless, of course, you got like 100% warrior blood or something that makes physical route really strong. Now, either route that you go, there are a couple things to watch out for, because remember, one mistake, one hit, and you die. So first off, the single most annoying move is the one where he flies up and then shoots this like chaos fire breath on the ground, which shoots out these balls of chaos that will randomly hit around it, and they're super hard to dodge, so sometimes you just randomly get hit by one and die. It's very annoying, and so if I'm using the melee build with the shield, I usually space away from this move just to make it less likely that I'll randomly get hit by it. The next one is once he flies up into the air for a second time at around 50% HP, he'll start using the move where he blows you back and shoots a bunch of balls. Usually this is just annoying as you can't really do damage during this time, but if you happen to be in the wrong spot without room to run backwards, you can die to it. So try to avoid cornering yourself when you can, or you might just die to this move in an unlucky time. Lastly, if you're using the melee strategy with the crossbow, watch out for the Frost AoE move that he uses, as usually you can walk out of it, but with crossbow your stand time is a little bit higher, so you might want to hold on to your space for this when possible, or if you have your space down, just don't play quite as aggressively with the crossbow. And that's all there is to it. I have technically not killed him in the 15-hour night, but I've gotten really close without any good blood, so I know it's definitely doable with these strategies, especially with high percentage warrior or scholar blood. You could honestly probably do it in 13-14 hours. Honestly, overall, this is a super fun fight to do underleveled. Even at 20 levels under, it's still a pretty basic fight, except this time you don't get the luxury of making any mistakes, which just makes it so much more challenging and enjoyable than it otherwise would be. Now that's all for this episode. We're one soul shard down, but in the next episode I'm likely going to take a step back from the final bosses and instead take a look at how we're going to reliably set up for them.
Right in the beans.